Hi. I would like to discuss three questions. What is critical reflection? How does one do it? And why is it important? In order to discuss these three questions, I would like to set an angle from which I discuss critical thinking, critical reflection. The angle that I set is individual in relation to society. That is, individuals' opinion, ideas, values, and assumptions are influenced by society. Also, that individual is agent of social change, that the individual has the ability to influence society. What is an individual that I want to see? Assumptions. Assumptions that individual makes about other individuals, groups of people, society, and about the surrounding social world. And these assumptions are expressed in form of ideas, views, values that people hold or upheld. What is in the assumption that I want to see? You see, assumptions are very important because we base our social action on assumption. If there is something wrong with the assumption, there is something wrong with social action. So, in order to free ourselves from wrong or problematic social actions, it is important that we establish a theoretical connection between the assumption and the related social action. Because that theoretical connection will enable us to understand what is wrong with the assumption and what can we do to improve upon it so that we can base our social action on better assumption for a better social change. Now, how does one make that theoretical connection between the assumption and the action? This is where comes in critical reflection. Critical reflection is also called critical thinking. Now, thinking is something that all people in the world do and basically do every single day. But this is not critical thinking, or what we call critical thinking in social sciences. Critical thinking is made of two important things. One is assumption. And by assumption, I mean dominant assumption. Assumptions that are hardly questioned by anyone in a society. Assumptions that almost everyone takes for granted. And assumptions that people express through their ideas, their views, values, their opinions. So, assumption is one thing that we need for critical thinking. The other thing that we need is theoretical framework. And this can be made of one or more theories of social sciences that explain cultural, political, social, structural, and historical influence on individual. In critical social science theories, dominant assumption is the one that has something to do with power. Because in critical science, social science theories, the relationship between individual and society is of power. And the dominant assumptions serve the purpose to maintain the existing power order. So theories related to power in that sense can make theoretical framework, and there are several theories. One name that immediately come to mind is Michel Foucault, French philosopher, who very beautifully explains how power operates. And he says that power is everywhere in the society and everyone has power. Sometimes we are victim of power and sometimes we are abuser of power. So everyone has power and power functions everywhere in society. And most importantly, he says that in order to understand the nature of power and how does it operate, one should focus on the experiences of those who have been directly exposed to power. So yes, theories about power can form theoretical framework for critical thinking. There is another set of theories that one can use use to form theoretical framework in critical thinking. And those theories explain how social structures and hierarchies are internalized and normalized through ideology and discourses. Again, one name that immediately comes to mind is again a French philosopher, Bourdieu, who explains how individuals are both free and constrained in making their choices in the social setup in the social world. His ideas of habitus and doxa can help explain how individual is both constrained and free. And so such theories can also make theoretical framework for critical thinking. And then we have another set of theories which explain relationship between law and culture. The idea is that state law is the only regulatory norm or only force, only power that regulate social relations. But this is not factually correct. In society, we see, in addition to state law, there are other norms, values, informal norms, values rooted in culture or in social relations that interact, that interface with the state law. Sometimes they compete with the state law, and sometimes they actually overrule state law. And then there are consequences for individuals, especially human rights consequences. For example, this idea that certain cultural practices are inherently incapable to accommodate certain human rights, and we cannot do anything about those cultural practices because they are too deeply rooted in a culture. For example, courts in certain countries give moderate or very little punishment in honor killing cases because honor killing is not seen as cold blooded murder. It is seen as something that has cultural legitimacy. Now, if we accept the assumption of cultural legitimacy in honor killing, then we just have to tolerate some people meeting violent deaths at hands of non-state actors, often in family relation. So of this is one example of state law and cultural norms interaction and consequences for human rights of certain people, right to life in this case. Another example we can find in the large welfare sector in Scandinavian countries. These social welfare structures have a large base of users who come from different backgrounds, different cultural, class backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds. These sectors are obligated to ensure all their users have equal access to understandable information. Now, the information is given out in the national languages in these countries, Norwegian in Norway, Danish language in Denmark, and so on. And so the assumption that because the information is available on the website and all the relevant letters are sent out to the relevant users well in time, and of course the information is in the national language, but somehow all the users will manage to not only access the information but also understand that information. This assumption is problematic because it leaves out those users who cannot understand the national language, Norwegian or Danish or Swedish. This means that this assumption violates the right of those users to equal access to understandable information. This assumption also violates the state obligation to ensure everyone has equal access to understandable information about social and health services. So, this is another example. So, yes, there are very many different theories in critical social science that can make a theoretical framework for critical thinking. Now, how do we do critical thinking? Well, you take the social experiment, social action, the assumption on which it was based, and then you find the relevant theory. You analyze the assumption, the related social experience or action in the light of those theories that forms the theoretical framework. And then this analysis can lead us in a different direction. One direction, one conclusion is that the assumption is the dominant assumption is okay. There's nothing wrong with it. A second conclusion can be another conclusion that the assumption has something problematic about it. There is something wrong with the assumption, and we need to amend it, to improve upon it, reform it. A third conclusion could be that the assumption is totally wrong and we have to reject it altogether. All these three conclusions are new knowledge in a sense because it helps us improve upon the assumption and the related social action. Take the conclusion that says that the assumption is okay. There's nothing wrong with it. Fine. But when we have undertaken critical reflection on this assumption and the related social experience or action, we find that the assumption is okay, but perhaps there was something wrong with the way this assumption was applied practically. For example, if we find out that the assumption was best interest of child. Now, this is an assumption that you do not want to give away. You want to keep it. But the critical reflection analysis process could also show us that something was wrong with the way this assumption was the objective based on this assumption was tried to achieve. The methodology to achieve best interest of child in that particular case or social action or experience, that methodology, that way of doing was there was something wrong with that. So that critical reflection process, although it has concluded that the assumption is okay, it's very good, but there is problem with the way we do this social action. That is also a new knowledge, and it can helps us improve upon the way we do this action, the way we take that action, and the result would be that we would be more efficient. There would be more efficient social action to materialize best interest of child. Now, this process of taking assumption, the related social experience or action, and the relevant theories and the analysis, this, as I said, creates new knowledge. So in that sense, critical analysis is also a process of new knowledge production, process of new theory building. And this process of theory building is liberating. And it is liberating in the sense because it liberates us from, it frees us from restricting assumption that in turn restricts our ways of being and doing. In other words, critical reflection gives individuals more choice in taking social actions because now the individual is free from the power hidden in the dominant assumption.